All right, guys. So we decided that John and I were going to start doing a little bit of Q&A for you guys on a periodic basis. So you'll start seeing more frequently us posting Q&As for getting questions for these recordings. And today we got some just general bodybuilding topics to kind of go over. We may target it more towards specific topics in later Q&As. But the question that we're going to go over today is going to be all-season diet setup and the logic behind that diet setup. So, John, go ahead and start with yours.
Sure. So at least for setting up an off-season diet, if I'm going to work with someone, and if you're already have an existing diet that you're working with, well, that's like a great baseline to go off of. And usually if I have a client doing an assessment, usually looking at what they're currently eating and then going off that, because that gives you a good idea of like, is this close to your maintenance calories? Have you been gaining off this? Usually what I do pick up is some people aren't reporting accurately, or most of the time if they send me something, it's very much underreported. And when I start a base plan, if I do base it off that calorie estimation, usually I start dropping weight because they aren't counting these extra little snack foods, or they're not counting every little thing that's in place. But let's assume you're starting from like ground zero, you have no tracking done whatsoever. Typically, calorie wise, as a starting point, the quick number I would crunch would be 15 kcals, roughly per pound of body weight. I think that gives you a good estimate around what your maintenance calories should be.
And then you can kind of adjust from there based on your activity level of your job and your training and the cardio that you're doing by tracking like weight logs and progress in the gym. One thing that I do think you do need to consider with an all-season diet setup plan is flexibility within the plan and choosing foods that are going to allow you to increase adherence. Because one of the big things that happens in all-season plans is the necessity or the openness to feel like you need cheat meals, which can throw you pretty far off if you go pretty, off plan with those cheat meals, like, mellow mushrooms and getting into some really dirty types of foods. Right. So for those that have like bad cravings issues, having options for substitutions is typically a good thing, and maybe like a variety of foods as well. Most people I see get satisfied with the bready options like English muffins and bagels, maybe even having an option for like the Krusty's pancakes that you use. I know you use that pretty frequently.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if your food selection within those calories is going to be important for adherence, absolutely. And if adherence is key, right? So you have to make a diet someone can adhere to. And the more adherent you can be in the off season, the better progress you can have. So if you're someone that's just have repeated cheat meals, it's like, well, let's try to build in something that meets that craving, but can kind of fit within the plan as well. That might mean that they have to run a slight less surplus because of what they're doing maybe on the weekend with their cheat meal. Do I think that's ideal? For a lot of people, it's probably not. But if you can make some middle ground up, and that's where, they don't go on the weekend, they eat 2,000 calories over their maintenance level, and they have to make that up. Maybe, hey, it's only 500 over maintenance or 1,000 over maintenance. Then that middle ground is a lot more productive. But the other end of the spectrum is like, you have to follow this strict plan, and then it blows up at some point, and then you really set back on what you have to do the remainder of the week and pull them back down potentially.
Right. And so understanding fully what you're taking in is probably the biggest aspect so that you can adjust from there. Now, I know one question I get a lot on off-season diet plans is the distribution of macronutrients.
We should probably just nail macros in general, right? It's for like setting up the plan. I would start with protein first. If you have this, so we've established what like around calories should be, maybe 15 calories per pound of body weight. This is like kind of your starting point, then programming in protein from there. I think a good starting point is probably 1 gram per pound. I think saying per pound is just easier for us in the States with calculations. So,
Yeah.
or 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. But that's not a hard number for me. I think within that, you could probably, relative to the off season, maximize protein synthesis and limiting protein breakdown. But there's some other benefits to going higher in protein. If it's appetite issues or if it's regarding hunger, protein is great for decreasing hunger within a diet plan. So that could be a strategy that you utilize. And then we also have some studies too, like showing like higher protein intakes potentially have a better partitioning in a calorie surplus and maybe limiting fat gain. That might just be that they, satisfied hunger more and they ended up eating less, and that there was a reporting error in those studies. Maybe it's the thermic effect of food. But we have some other studies in bodybuilders that looking at, I think it's Demoris. I think it was a 2017 study.
I don't know the author on that one.
You know one that's coming to mind. It
Yeah,
was
but some of them, and not that in that specific one, but some of those protein studies are up to like 4 grams per kilo and 4.2 grams per kilo.
those the
As like
Antonio studies.
Antonio study, yeah. But I mean, so you have room to play with there. A starting point, obviously, being at that 2.2 grams per kilo or 1 per pound. I like to push it up to around 1.5 is typically where I have a lot of my people, somewhere in that ballpark of the 1.5 grams per pound of body weight.
I think that gives you a good range, like 1 to 1.5, and getting up to that 1.5 if you need to with appetite issues or partitioning effects. But yeah, I kind of lean towards that upper end too. What's your next macro that you'd program for after protein?
Probably carbohydrate distribution for most people. So for the most part, in an off-season, carbohydrate distribution is going to be relatively equal across the day, except for around training. Now, that is where typically I do start a little higher relative to what their meals are through the day. So if I have an example of a client that's like somewhere in that 30 to 40 grams of carbs per meal, as a starting base point, their pre-workout meal and their post-workout meal are probably closer to 55, 60, maybe with a little carbohydrates while they train as well. Just because of the upregulation of GLUT4 while we train, we're a little bit more predisposed to utilize carbohydrates in a training state or post-training state. So I do have a tendency to kind of push a little bit more there. Also, I kind of cater it to what time of day they typically train if they have a consistent schedule, so that, more of their carbohydrates lead into their session. So like if they're training on meal 3, 1, 2, 3 are all carbohydrate meals.
So would you set up carb amounts for like totals for the day before fat intake? Is that how you
That's
program?
typically how I approach it. Just because, well, I mean, so I look at them both as energy macronutrients. So for me, it's going to be kind of something I do at the same time based off the total calorie intake of the individual. But I am more focused on the carbohydrate take than I am in the fat intake, right? So I'm typically a little bit of a higher on the percentage side of carbohydrate intake. So you can think of like a 40-40-20 type of thing. Or even a little less, depending on the individual. I do have some people that function a little bit better on a higher fat compared to carbohydrates distribution. So obviously that's adjusted for them. But depending on intake for the majority of people, I am kind of more on the energy and macronutrient based side, a little bit higher on the carbohydrates.
Yeah, I'm on the same as well. And you can look at overfeeding studies, which is just overfeed fat, and there's what happens. You just gain more fat.
Yeah,
So,
and insulin sensitivity is reduced.
yeah,
Well,
and we talked about this before. Like when you want to build insulin resistance in these mice studies, they don't overfeed them carbohydrate; they overfeed them fat, which is super interesting, right? So, but yeah, like you're saying, like with resistance training, it is mainly working in anaerobic capacities. So there is a focus in carbohydrate. And I think there is something to be said for the protein sparing effects that it has and potential in decreasing protein breakdown over the day. Also, raising insulin levels throughout the day, I think, has a very good impact in anabolism itself too.
Well, right. We know insulin's a direct downstream mediator of mTOR along in the pathway. So we should understand that using insulin as a driver of recovery for muscle hypertrophy is very important. Now, blood glucose control within an off-season diet setup is important as well. Not everybody necessarily monitors that, but a common thing I use with people is berberine a couple times a day, 2 or 3 times a day, just to kind of help with blood glucose management. And you can get blood glucose monitors really easy for those that are interested in it.
Yeah, I think the big picture with that, like everyone's worried about insulin sensitivity, is keeping body fat in check and working within a reasonable calorie surplus. So whether whether you're overfeeding high fat or overfeeding carbohydrate, you can decrease insulin sensitivity either way, but it's that rate of surplus that's going to be the issue. So managing that and monitoring how quickly you're gaining and looking at your pictures and seeing like, is this body fat gain or is it lean tissue gain? That's the best thing to monitor as far as tracking your progress and keeping that sensitivity. I typically will look at fats first.
Okay.
And I play with them, so I'll look at fats, and typically I'm going on the lower end. If I had to say, probably most of my diet's around 20% fats,
Yes.
which for most people that probably breaks down to maybe 0.2 to 0.5 grams of fat per pound of body weight. And then I'll plug in the rest for carbohydrate and see where that falls. And that might be somewhere between 1 to 3 grams of carbohydrate per pound of body weight. Could be higher, could be less, but a lot of this weighs into, from that point, it's you're just giving energy, so it's
Right.
what works best for the person. Some people do work better with higher fat, some people work better with higher carbohydrates. I think as long as you're not overfeeding some macronutrient, that limits the other. So with protein being, I think, very important, not limiting protein. Carbohydrate also not going so low that you're limiting performance and recovery.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing why you go carbs first is you definitely want to fuel performance and recovery before you're giving too much dietary fat. So you just you plug in both and kind of look at what your ratios are, then start up your base plan and then monitor how that person responds.
And I'm gonna say that the starting point of any diet I write is definitely protein. So like I'm putting that 1.5, well, somewhere in that 1.5 area first, and then I'm going to carbohydrates and fats. And that's just my method. You can look at them both as just energy and distribute it how you want, right?
Yeah, I think we're the same as far as like you put it all together and you look at the numbers as a whole and say, okay, this works well, or you adjust from there.
Right. One question I had is, do you have a suggested rate of weight gain for off season, week to week?
Yes, and it definitely depends on the level of the individual. And so I think that's a consideration for if you're a beginner or intermediate, you're going to be able to have a faster rate of muscle accrual. So you're going to have a faster rate of weight gain versus an advanced athlete, or you're going to have a much slower rate of muscle accrual, and that weight gain is going to look a lot more limited. So if you went percentage based, it's probably around that 0.25 to 0.5% weight increase per week, roughly. I hate focusing on a number like that because
Yeah,
it makes a hard stop for someone that's like, okay, well, that I didn't hit that weight target, I'm going to increase food. Well, maybe there's other factors at play that why didn't your weight didn't increase this week?
right.
Maybe you shouldn't increase food. I mean, I've seen the percentages higher for beginners, like 0.5 to 1% weight
Yeah.
gain per week. Maybe that is reasonable for beginners, so you're not limiting yourself. Then you decrease down to that like 0.25, 0.5 as you become more advanced. I think if you're don't in a beginning stage and you don't have a good way to track and you don't have a good understanding of what to really look for putting the picture together, probably that 0.5 to 1% weight gain increase every 1 to 2 weeks would be a good guideline.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you're not hitting that, then make a slight adjustment to your calorie intake, 5 to 10%. Go from there for 1 to 2 weeks and keep moving forward. I do think like the main thing we're trying to go for is muscle hypertrophy. So I would make sure you monitor your body weight, your pictures. I think what is very pertinent is muscle circumference and body fat caliper site. So if you're trying to increase arm size, if you have an increase in the tape measure around your arm and maybe your tricep skin fold does not increase, well, that could be, fairly indicative that you put on some lean tissue. I think there's even some regression models and research where you can kind of use that as an indicator for muscle growth.
Yeah.
It's by far not like, the best way to do it, but no, but for us just at home, it's pretty good,
Yeah. And they'll use some of those in strength-based studies just to give a hypertrophy measure sometimes if they don't have the DEXA there. But I think the summary of it all is protein first, balance your energy accordingly to where you feel like you function best on. You probably distribute carbohydrates or process carbohydrates at a higher rate around training. So take that into consideration. Track and monitor your progress over time. I'm going to say the time I'm pretty much on that same body weight percentage per week type of progression as well. So as far as an all-season diet setup, that should help get you started, and then allow you to monitor back and forth as you progress.
Sounds good to me.